First Corinthians chapter 11 is about authority and the church. But rather than examine whether or not women should pray with their head covered, let's examine another side. It says men should pray uncovered. Yet in this day and age, we find some men who pray with their head covered claim authority over the universal church. What does First Corinthians chapter 11 say about their claims? One of my texts today is going to be from First Corinthians chapter 11. And in that chapter, the thing that everybody loves to talk about is women wearing or not wearing head coverings in the church service. And I've already made another video about 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And I also didn't talk about women's head coverings in that one. And I have opinions about women's head coverings, and it would be probably opinions that would make both sides mad. My opinion would probably make radical egalitarians mad, and it would also make traditionalists mad. I've already got enough people mad at me just about things where I'm confident I'm right, like early Genesis and the Christ-centered model, and how the traditional view, the rabbinical view of Genesis that the church has adopted is the completely wrong narrative, and we need to reinterpret the whole thing in the light of Christ. Basically what this channel is really about. And so I don't need to get a bunch more people mad at me about something that I don't think matters that much and I'm not that sure of anyway. So I'll go ahead, and I'm not afraid to make people mad at me when it's necessary and where I'm confident I'm right. But I'm going to quote 1 Corinthians chapter 11 without I say weighing in on women's head coverings. My other video on 1 Corinthians chapter 11 was showing that my view of Adam and Eve, and Adam is not the first man, is almost mandated by the text of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, that you either have to believe that women are not really created in the image of God, or you have to believe that the image of God was something that Adam had, and that it is a relational. It is not something that is intrinsic to human beings. And the reason Eve did not, the reason it's stated the way it is not because Eve was somehow inferior in her capacity, but because of the nature of the relationship and who and what the image of God really is. But please see that video if you want to talk about that. I want to talk about another aspect, another controversial, and to me, more important issue from 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that has seemed to escape notice. And that has to do with the question of church authority and the church system. And I do not want this to become, just as I made a video saying that I don't want this to be the anti-Michael Heiser channel, that I look forward to meeting my brother Michael Heiser in heaven, even though he's wrong on the unseen realm stuff. And I have a lot of videos here, like 5 or 6, showing where the unseen realm theology, which is basically Second Temple period Judaism, repackaged, that they're now trying to bring back into Christian theology, and it's completely wrong. They're the guys who didn't get it. They're the guys who didn't see Jesus in the scriptures. And the scriptures, their true meaning is screaming, it's all about Christ, including early Genesis. But I agreed with them on many things. And in the same way, I'm now making videos about church authority and is there a one true church? And there is a one true church, but it's not any one human institution. And because of that, I've come into conflict with, I would say, not all Catholics. I've got Catholics, really some of my best friends are Catholics, and the evangelical church is sick and could learn a lot from the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church as well. They could learn a lot because they are doing as many or more things wrong than the Catholics. That the evangelical churches are not on the high ground. If you look at the total scope of their teaching and the total scope of their practice and the way they do things, there's serious problems there. However, the Church of Rome is not the one true church. And nor is in the Eastern Orthodox Church is a split off from that. And so they are not either. They're not. The one true church is a universal church. It is found when I get together with my friends who are Catholics and we give thanks to God and we learn about the Lord together. We're having our own little church service right there that is neither an evangelical service nor is it a Catholic service. But Jesus said, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, I'm in the midst of them. And if you have him, what else do you need more than him? What needs to be added to him to make it a good church? And so, I say that, and there might be some that will try to answer that question in terms of things that the professional clergy does with the congregation. And that is because of something I've talked about before, institutionalism. Institutionalism it's not just in churches, it's in government, it's in business, it's in everything. Whenever you get a bureaucracy or an organization that's big enough, it takes on a life of its own. It starts to work in its own interests, regardless of whatever purpose it was founded for. It has a new purpose once it reaches a certain size and scope, and that is its own well-being. And because of that, there's an unfortunate tendency for churches, not just Catholic, not just Eastern Orthodox, but the evangelical church might at times do it too, to try to insert the organization of the church into the salvation process. And I'm not saying it isn't connected to it in some way, but I'm talking about in terms of necessity. And so, that is something that I would have to oppose. I don't believe it's the truth. I think that Christianity, it's personal. Yes, it should be communal too, but that community is not, you can't point to it and say, look, here it is, or it's over there. It exists in the fellowship that we have together when we assemble together. Even if we go to different churches on Sunday or Saturday or whatever day we go to church. So I think the Bible does teach a universal church, and it's so obvious that I'm not even going to bother to show you scriptures that there is a universal church. The nature of that universal church, however, is what I want to discuss, and 1 Corinthians chapter 11 has one verse of scripture that speaks to it. And it is after Paul goes through the thing about the head coverings, and we do it like this. Here, doesn't nature itself teach you this is the way it's supposed to be? And at the end he says, if anyone is contentious about this, we don't have any other custom, nor do the other churches of God. Now, there has been a dispute. There is a dispute about church practice and worship, about what goes on in the assembly. That's what 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is about. And Paul is attempting to resolve the dispute about church practice. But did he appeal to a pope? No. Did he appeal to that there's only one church? No. He used the plural, churches. And he said if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So he did not appeal to Peter. He did not appeal to a pope. He did not say we need to follow the one central authority in this matter of church practice. He said, look, if you want to be contentious, fine, but we don't do it any other way, nor do these other churches do it. As if the authority is not in one person, it is not in some vicar of Christ, but it is in the fellowship, the idea that we're churches, we need to fellowship, and when we get together, if there's an area of dispute, we should all do it the same way when we're having that fellowship. So it's evidence that even though there is a universal church, and we confess that when we confess the Nicene Creed, there's one. Really, the word Catholic means universal. That's what it means. Catholic is a Latin word. We keep the Latin word in English when we really, if we're translating it like we do all the other words, we should say universal. So that's in 1 Corinthians. He's not appealing to a pope. He's not appealing to a vicar. And in the same way, in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, and I won't bother to read the whole thing, but the letters to the 7 churches, basically John is saying what Jesus is telling him. And Jesus is like, I'm walking among these 7 golden candlesticks, which is connected to the 7 churches. And basically, Jesus is going to these 7 churches, and he's telling John, here's what I want you to write to this one. Here's what I want you to write to that one. Here's what I want you to write to the other one. And so, what need is there for a vicar of Christ to sort these out? Christ is telling John these things. Christ is giving instructions to the churches. And John is telling these churches what that instruction is. If Christ is doing it, and if they fail to do it, he says, if you don't do X, I'm going to do Y. I'm going to do Y. He is dealing with it personally. He says, I'm glad you're doing this, but I don't want you doing that. If you keep doing this other, these are going to be the consequences. I fail to see how that fits into the system that later developed, where the Bishop of Rome becomes the deciding authority for all churches. And in fact, even though like the Eastern Orthodox may say, well, okay, that's right, because it isn't the Roman Catholic Church. We're the true Catholic Church. We're the one true church. And we do have churches that decide these matters. There's a multiplicity of bishops who have the final ruling authority. And that is closer. The Eastern Orthodox, I think, is probably closer to what I see laid out in the Scriptures. However, the churches, the leaders of the churches that make the decisions for the Eastern Orthodox Church, they're not any of the churches listed in Revelation, the 7 churches. They're not any of the churches that, except perhaps the Romans, and then they say, well, they've got power mad and we split off from them. They're not the ones that any of the letters were written to. The 5 churches, one of them is Jerusalem. One of them is Antioch or something. The idea is their churches were picked by a Roman emperor. I think it was in the 500s. And he said, these are the churches whose bishops matter the most. They are the ones that are going to decide for everybody. And so that isn't the system that's in the Bible either. The system that's in the Bible drives people crazy because it is not centralized. There is not a centralized place of control. There is not a power structure. There is not a hierarchy that if you can capture the top of it, you can move the whole organization. It ultimately rests with the people and with the leadership in that one area. And they are obligated in a way to listen to apostles, but in some things they are not. For instance, head coverings. Paul didn't say, you've got to do it this way because we, the council, have decided, or the vicar of Christ has decided. Didn't do any of that. All that is later accretions on to New Testament Christianity. Nothing established by Christ. What we see Christ doing, he is walking among the 7 candlesticks, which are the 7 churches. He is saying, here's where you're doing well, here's where you're failing. And if we had that list today, I think it would be very embarrassing. If Christ, and perhaps he is, perhaps Christ is walking around different churches today and making observations and saying, if they don't do this, I'm going to do that. And I fear that judgment is coming on the church, not the Catholic Church worse than the Protestant Church, not the Eastern Orthodox Church worse than the Baptist or the Methodist. I feel like we have all gone astray, and we all need to, in humility, find our way back to the purity of the faith that I see in the New Testament, that you can see in the New Testament if you read it. And that doesn't mean that we don't need to, any authority structure. It doesn't mean that we don't need to listen to one another. We do need to listen to one another. And what undermines that is one institution getting institutionalism so badly, it mars their soul so badly that they say, we're the one true church, we're the only way to God. God is confined to operating through us. We're in control here. They're not in control. God's in control. And he will use us to the extent we let. But that's what mars fellowship. That is what mars fellowship between believers who in good conscience believe different things about what the scriptures say. And you can't even have a discussion with some of them without them getting abusive with you, because they are so committed to the institution and not to truth discovery and not to being loving and understanding about our differences. Not saying, well, we can work through that. We can work through that. But if you believe that your religious institution is the sole way that God, the one true church, that's how God operates through the earth, through you. It's got to come through you. And you also insert yourself into the salvation process. I don't mean the sanctification process. I mean the salvation process. And I'm speaking in evangelical terms here. I know that, like say, the Eastern Orthodox, they have a view of salvation that is different from evangelicals. And once again, I think the Eastern Orthodox are mostly right about this. And I think I need to do another video about their view of salvation as not just a single transaction, but as an ongoing, lifelong process. It's both. I think it's both. And that if the evangelical church has just done the one, but they're ignoring the other, then they're missing the mark. But there's more than one way to miss the mark. And the other way to miss the mark is for that process, for the church to insert itself over much, and then the necessity of the church over much into that process. That is really the Holy Spirit is in charge of it. So, in conclusion, if you look at the way they handle disputes in the Bible, and I had another video about this too, about why it is unlikely that papal authority, even if the Pope inherited the seat of Peter, Peter didn't exercise the kind of authority that the popes are now claiming for themselves. So it's really unlikely that he had that authority and that they inherited that. Even if they did inherit the authority, he didn't have the authority that they're claiming. But beyond that, this verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and the verse in Revelations, and I'm sure some other places I could find, show that they did not have this top-down structure. They did not have a single vicar of Christ defining church practice. That's not how they solve problems. That's not how they resolve disputes. A lot of times they let the dispute simmer. Sometimes they took their stand and said, you're in the club and you're out of the club. But other times they tolerated one another and they kept talking about it, and they let them have different practices while they continued showing patience and love for one another. And that's when the church was at its best. When it was at its worst was when it became a power grab aligned with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had veto power over the bishops, meddled in who was the Pope, and they use their power backed by the state to declare anathema to a bunch of people. Some of them probably had it coming, but once you get going in that process, you tend to overuse it. So that's really all I had to say about that, is that the scriptures do not seem to support the model that all churches are supposed to answer to a single hierarchy. There's no vicar of Christ to resolve disputes on church practice, and it's simply things that are not in the Bible, and that even if Peter has some kind of special role for the church, that does not appear to have been it. So even if the Bishop of Rome somehow becomes his legitimate successor, which it's hard to justify that process as well, then that still doesn't mean we all have to go to one single denomination, one single religious authority to find a God who is above all. Thank you so much for listening, and may God bless you.